Canada and Mexico will be among the hardest hit by these tariffs. Together, the two accounted for almost 40% of U.S. steel imports in 2024. This new tariff comes 1 week after President Trump pressed pause on tariffs after Mexico and Canada presented plans to secure their borders. But with this new targeted threat, what is in store for America's two largest trading partners? My next guest has firsthand experience negotiating on behalf of Mexico against Trump. Kenneth Smith Ramos is Mexico's former chief negotiator for the modernization of NAFTA and now a partner at Agon. Hello, thank you very much for making the time. I'm wondering, what would you say, sir, is the mood right now in Mexico with first the reprieve and then going ahead with these more specific tariffs?
Thank you very much, Catherine. Well, now that the tariffs have been imposed, there's definitely a somber mood. There was the expectation, given the reprieve that was obtained from the imposition of the 25% tariffs across the board, which Trump delayed for at least a month. There was the expectation, both from the Mexican government and the Mexican private sector, that there could be the possibility of having a constructive dialogue on the foreign policy issues that are of interest to the U.S. and also to Mexico, such as immigration and security, and to avoid the tariff threat. Now it seems that the U.S. certainly going back on its word, imposing tariffs as they did in 2018 on steel and aluminum products. It will have an impact in Mexico and Canada. As you well mentioned, Mexico is one of the top exporters, along with Canada, to the United States. And I just fail to see how the United States increases its competitiveness or strengthens its steel and aluminum sectors by hitting with tariffs its number one and number two trading partners, with whom there is a very symbiotic relationship when it comes to trade, not just in steel and aluminum, but in all manufacturing products and inputs for the manufacturing industry.
So, well,
perhaps will increase prices in the U.S. So, I mean, there's no benefit to them, really.
Well, I suppose one analysis of the situation, though, is that the benefit is perhaps that these tariffs line the U.S. coffers at a time where the United States is looking for revenue for some of its projects. And I guess, where does that leave both Mexico and Canada if both sort of ideologically Donald Trump and his administration believe very much in these tariffs, but they have a sort of a financial motivation of sorts, an economic motivation in terms of fueling their own plans?
Yeah, of course. But at some point, public policy has to align with economic reality. I mean, it's one thing what Peter Navarro and his friends think in the White House. The reality is that, with the imposition of tariffs, not only are you violating the USMCA and subjecting yourself to retaliation from both Canada and Mexico, but it is a complete, misunderstanding of how tariffs work when they think they're really going to create a lot of wealth in the United States through tariffs. If tariffs are too high, as they are being put too high in this case, what winds up happening is that trade with your trading partners starts slowing down, trickling down, or even disappearing. So either the importers, do not pay that extra cost in terms of the tariffs imposed because they stop importing from Mexico or from Canada, or at the end of the day, that supposed savings from the United States, gets passed on as a cost to U.S. consumers. Anybody who's involved in purchasing steel from abroad for construction, for the automotive sector, for machinery and equipment and aerospace is going to make products that are more costly. And at the end of the day, it's going to hit consumers in their pocketbook. So that's the reality of how tariffs work and the disruption that is created.
You, I'm sure, learned many lessons negotiating with Trump 1.0. Are many of those lessons, are there lessons that are applicable, or are we just dealing with a totally different animal in terms of the Trump 2.0 administration?
No, I think that, of course, Trump 2.0 seems to be much more aggressive on all fronts when it comes to foreign policy, much more interventionist when it comes to trade policy. This notion and mantra of tariffs as the way forward for U.S. trade policy. But in a way, President Trump is predictable. He's been consistent on these thoughts for a very long time, not just on tariffs, but on his obsession with the trade deficit, with offshoring when U.S. companies invest abroad. So at the same time, we can expect that even though he creates this tension, this disruption, which is part of his strategy to sort of soften up trading partners, he does leave room for negotiation. And I think that's what we saw in the USMCA. You may recall in 2017, 2018, numerous times he said he was going to pull out of the NAFTA. And at the end of the day, we wind up with a comprehensive, balanced agreement that's good for all three countries. So there is room for negotiation, but there is going to be a lot of turbulence. And I think it really hurts the U.S. credibility as a reliable trading partner, not just in North America, but to other countries in the world, when the U.S. demands that Europe opens markets or else, and they see how the U.S. is treating its number one, number two trading partners. Well, it's hard for the U.S. to demand for other countries to comply with international commitments when they are not willing to abide by theirs.
Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has said that Mexico is going to approach this with a cool head. I wonder what you would say about how her approach thus far seems to be working with Donald Trump.
Well, I think so far, I mean, at least until today, it has worked, because I think President Sheinbaum has been clear in stating that on the one hand, you need to be firm on saying if there's violations to the USMCA, Mexico has to take measures. But on the other hand, leaving a door open for a constructive dialogue in the case in particular that was discussed last week, which is immigration and security, and of course, the upcoming review of 2026. But amongst the lessons we learned from Trump 1.0 is that back in 2018, when the U.S. imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum against Mexico and Canada, within a month, Mexico and Canada had retaliated. In the case of Mexico, over $1 billion worth of retaliation. And that led the United States to sit down with Mexico and Canada and negotiate exemptions to the automotive sector for any measure on national security under Section 232, and then a special mechanism to negotiate any possible impact on other national security measures. So the lesson is clear. If you stand your ground, if you do honor the commitments in the USMCA and you defend them, maybe retaliation is also a good option. We don't want an escalation of trade war between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S., but you just can't let the United States completely roll over you. I think that's the strategy that so far Mexico has been pursuing. We will see what they do in terms of the tariffs that are being imposed today.
I'm curious what you would say about how the relationship between our two countries is doing, given that early on in this discussion, there were certainly politicians in Canada who frankly said, like, cut them loose. If it's in our best interest, bye-bye Mexico. How are things now?
Well, I mean, I said it at that time that it was a mistake in terms of trying to divide, Mexico and Canada, to try to separate each other and not work together as we did in many instances in the USMCA negotiation. I think, by working together, we were stronger in that negotiation, and we avoided many of the more protectionist or anti-free trade policies the U.S. was pursuing. So I think the best option for Mexico and Canada is precisely to try to have a constructive dialogue and try to figure out how to approach this situation with Trump. Not only in the actual discussions of the USMCA that will come later on this year, but immediately how to coordinate action on possible retaliation, what type of dialogue should take place between the presidents and the prime minister, and also at the levels of USTR and the Department of Commerce. At the end of the day, we benefit tremendously from a relationship where, we have over $50 billion in trade with Canada. Canada is our third largest investor in many important sectors such as manufacturing, energy, mining. So that relationship can only grow if we play it right and if we stick to what should be the future of the USMCA, which is having a trilateral agreement.
What about the 30-day reprieve or the 1-month reprieve? How much optimism are you feeling about that at this moment?
Well, I mean, not much, really, because Trump can change his mind in a minute. I think it was a good result for President Sheinbaum through that call to be able to obtain that month reprieve. But it becomes very hard for countries to negotiate in good faith and with a constructive dialogue if you have a gun pointing at your head constantly. So I think at some point, the outcome of these discussions, and I hope that's taking place now between the Mexican government and the U.S. government, is to have a sort of agreement on disarming this tariff threat, right? So have a long-lasting peace, or at least in the medium term, while the countries work on foreign policy issues such as immigration and security, and certainly as the time approaches for the review in 2026. We are allies, we are partners, we've been friends for a very long time, the same as Mexico and Canada. We should not be pointing guns at each other, much less having trade wars between one another, because the only people that benefit from a trade war in North America is precisely our biggest competitors, is China and other countries that are probably laughing seeing what is going on between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S.
Yes, and that is a case that I know Canadians have been making even on cable news in the United States, and yet the question of the extent to which there is uptake on that. I'm curious also, one of the things I think Canadians are sort of struggling to come to terms with here is the kind of language that Donald Trump is using when he talks about Canada. Questioning whether it's even a viable country, concerned that he wants to annex or absorb this country through economic force. You know, I think it's safe to say, and I may not be speaking about politicians here, but there are some people in Canada who are pretty freaked out by that. No question, he has been being very provocative about Mexico too, right? He had that big prop yesterday, the Gulf of America map, sort of a little bit of swagger there. Tell me a little bit about how the national conversation is going in Mexico around those kinds of comments.
Well, definitely, just as with Trump 1.0 in Trump 2.0, what we're seeing is the population reacting to all of these messages, right? I mean, back in 2017, 2018, just as he's doing with Canada now, he put us through the ringer talking about, you know, the people that came from Mexico to the U.S. were all criminals.
Yep.
Mexico's going to pay for the border wall. So this is the MO that Trump utilizes to try to pressure trading partners, even allies. And it's very unfortunate. I mean, it's even gotten worse to the point where there's threats of, you know, taking Greenland, invading the Panama Canal, or buying out the Gaza. So, you know, you have to understand that within his logic, these are just negotiating positions. But the problem is the rest of the world doesn't know how far he's going to go, because in the case of tariffs, he has used them before. He's threatened to go all the way to 25%. And we know that within USTR and the Department of Commerce, they think that it's absolute folly. At least the civil service people within there think it's crazy because it's really going to hurt the U.S. economy. But this time around, the White House is much more radical when it comes to those positions. So what I would say that we learned in the 2017-2019 negotiation of the USMCA is, to the degree that it's possible, to leave out the political noise. You know, the U.S. is not going to try to annex Canada. It's not going to make Mexico pay for the wall. But at the end of the day, we have to leave that aside and try to concentrate, as President Sheinbaum said, keeping a cool head, retaliating when you have to, and trying to negotiate. Because at the end of the day, you know, there's enough pressure within the U.S., and we have to help create it also, Mexico and Canada, with the private sector, with Congress, with civil society, so that cooler heads prevail, and that he winds up moving towards more moderate positions, which is what wound up happening in 2018 when we finally were able to sign a trade agreement. A year before that, that seemed impossible.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. Cooler heads prevail, a good message for folks to take with them. Thank you very much for your time. Kenneth Smith Ramos, Mexico's former chief negotiator for the modernization of NAFTA.
Real pleasure, Catherine. Thank you.